Hi everyone, welcome to my channel Bibbity Bobbity Books. My name is Ellie and this is going to be my February reading wrap up. I had a really good reading month in February. I'm really pleased with the amount of books that I read. I think I read a grand total of 10 books, which is crazy for me because I normally read about 4 or 5 books per month. So somehow I've managed to double that. I do think it's because I did have some time off work in February, so I had more time to devote to reading. And I also read quite a few short stories and novellas and things. So I think that's part of the reason why my number is so high for this month. But yeah, I'm really excited to talk to you about all of the books that I read. I do feel like this video is probably going to end up being quite long, so I will leave timestamps down below. So if you want to hear my thoughts on a specific book, you can jump ahead and just watch that section. But without further ado, I am just going to jump straight in with the first book that I read in February. So the first book that I read in February was a horror novella and it was called Mapping the Interior by Stephen Graham Jones. So I read this one on my Kindle because I've been really craving horror recently, and this is a really interesting novella. It follows a 17-year-old boy, a Native American boy, and he is convinced that he's seen his late father's ghost, and he's desperate to get his father's ghost back so that he can help him with his younger brother who's experiencing seizures. And it turns into a really unsettling story, and I would describe it more as a coming of age story that explores some really complex and interesting themes rather than a straight up horror story, because I didn't find it particularly scary or particularly horrific. It's more just very unsettling and makes you think. I do feel like the focus in this story is very much about our main character having to process his grief after his father died and also trying to figure out his identity within this new family unit. And I definitely feel like there's quite a lot to unpack with this story, and I do think that quite a lot of the themes went over my head a little bit because I did struggle to follow the story, and I think that's in part because of the writing style and the prose. It's all told from our main character's perspective, and he has kind of racing thoughts, so I found that his thoughts would jump all over the place in the book, and that made it really hard for me to follow along with the story and get my head around exactly what was happening. And it's also one of those stories that is quite ambiguous and leaves things open to interpretation for the reader, and sometimes I do enjoy that, but in this particular story I just felt confused most of the time, if I'm being honest. So sadly for me this one didn't quite work, but don't let that put you off because this book has got a lot of really positive reviews, so if you feel like it's something that you would be interested in, maybe check it out and I would love to have a chat with you about it. Okay, so next up we have House of Hollow by Krystal Sutherland. This is a horror story and I've had this one on my TBR for the longest time. I feel like it was really popular on BookTube quite a few years ago, and since then I've always wanted to read it but just haven't picked it up for some reason, and I'm so glad that I finally did because I really enjoyed this. This is definitely my style of horror. It ticked all of the boxes for me. It was inspired by folklore and fairy tales, which I just love. It had really lyrical and whimsical descriptive writing, but it was also incredibly horrific and disturbing as well, and I also just love that style of writing. It had some really interesting morally grey characters, and it also explored some really interesting themes including grief and family and desperation, and it was just so good. But what is this book actually about? So in this story we follow our main character, who is a girl called Iris, and I think she's about 18 in this story, and we find out very early on that Iris and her 2 older sisters had this really traumatic event that happened to them when they were children. So we find out that they actually went missing for an entire month when they were children, and then they randomly like reappeared and were discovered again in the exact same location that they went missing a month prior. And they seem to be unharmed, they seem to have been sort of well fed. The only thing that was a little bit strange about the girls was that they all had a scar on their neck, this weird half moon shaped scar, and none of the children could remember what happened to them. And then we fast forward to when Iris is 18 years old, and we follow her As she is going through life, we see that she's never really felt like she fits in. She's always felt like she's a little bit strange. And then her older sister, who's called Grey, ends up going missing again. And Iris and her middle sister decide to investigate what's happened to their older sister. And during their investigations, they uncover some traumatic secrets about their past, and it turns into a really creepy and disturbing horror story. And that's all I'm going to say because I don't want to spoil anything, but I really enjoyed this one. I will say that looking back, I do think that some of the plot twists and the storylines may be quite predictable, so if you're good at predicting things then you might guess what's going on from an early stage, but I personally was just so absorbed in the atmospheric writing that I didn't find myself wanting to guess or trying to figure out what was going on. I was just in it for the ride, and I had a great time with this one. So I would highly recommend this to you if you enjoy a dark fairy tale, but do be warned that it is quite graphic, and if you don't like body horror or gruesome descriptions, then you might want to stay clear of this one. Okay, so next up we have a chunky epic adult fantasy, and that is Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb. I finally picked up a Robin Hobb book. This is an author that I've been wanting to read for a really long time, but I've been putting off for one reason or another, and I finally decided to just jump straight in with this first book. So this is the first book in the Farseer trilogy, which is the first trilogy within Robin Hobb's realm of the Elderlings, because she's basically created this really expansive fantasy world, and if you want to start from the very beginning, this is the book that you need to pick up. And in this story we follow our main character Fitz, so it's all told from first person perspective and it's retrospective as well. And we follow him throughout his childhood years. So we first meet him when I think he's 6 years old, and then by the end of this first book he's like a early to mid teenager. And it's a true sort of beginning to a fantasy series in that nothing crazy happens plot-wise, but it's all about understanding the character and understanding the world. It is incredibly slow-paced, and I will say that towards the beginning of this book I wasn't sure if I was going to get on with this series because I didn't feel like I connected very much with our main character of Fitz, and I also just found it incredibly slow. But the more that I read through this story, the more that I came to appreciate the complexity of the fantasy world that Robin Hobb has built in this story, and I started to slowly piece things together, and the intrigue just built for me. So by the time I reached the end of this book, I was in it and I was like, yes, I need to finish this fantasy series. But yeah, what is this actually about? So I mentioned that the main character is a boy called Fitz, and he is the bastard son of the king in waiting. And the story opens with him being delivered to the royal keep by his grandfather, because his grandfather decides that he can't afford to keep Fitz any longer, and he feels that it's the royal family's responsibility to look after him because he is the bastard son of the king in waiting. And so the royal family take him in, and they can't deny that he is the bastard of the king in waiting because Fitz looks very familiar. He looks exactly the same as the king in waiting, so he's clearly of royal blood. So they have to take him in, and they're not really sure what to do with him. So they decide to give him to the stable master, who basically raises him as a stable boy. And then as he gets older, we follow Fitz as he's struggling to fit in, because when he's mixing with the lower classes, he doesn't quite fit in or feel like he can relate to those people because they treat him a bit differently because he is of royal blood. But then when he mixes with the nobility, he's not really given much respect by them because they just see him as a bastard and not a full royal person. So he's kind of a bit of a misfit really, and we see how that affects him as a person. And then he's approached by the king, and the king decides to train Fitz up as a royal assassin and to use his position as a royal bastard to their advantage, because Fitz can kind of go unnoticed wherever he goes because he can mix with the lower classes and no one really pays that much attention to him, and he can also mix with the upper classes and again no one really pays much attention to him. So he trains up to become a royal assassin, and the story takes on from there. And what I really really enjoy about this series is the magic system, because we have some really interesting types of magic in here and types of magic that I haven't seen before in other fantasy series, which is really refreshing. So in here we have a type of magic called the wit, which is basically a way to communicate or connect with animals, and that type of magic is really frowned upon and people describe it as like a beastly type of magic. It's kind of illegal and you're not really supposed to use it. And then there's another type of magic called the skill, which is normally used by the royalty or the upper classes, and it's a type of mind magic, which is really interesting, and I'm still finding out more about it because this is the type of story that doesn't give you everything straight away. It doesn't spoon feed you. You have to kind of just slowly figure things out as you read through the stories. And yeah, I thought that was quite interesting. I will say it's not a particularly hard magic system, so if that's something that you enjoy in your fantasy stories, you might not necessarily get on with this one. You just kind of have to accept that some people have these skills. So yeah, I'm really glad that I finally have started reading Robin Hobb, and I'm excited to continue on with this one. Okay, so next up we have a manga, and the manga that I picked up was The Girl from the Other Side. I don't think I'm going to be able to pronounce the author's name correctly, so I'm going to just write their names on the screen for you because I don't want to butcher it. But this is such a sweet manga, and it takes place in a world where there are two kingdoms. You have the outside, which is where these cursed monsters live, and then you have the inside, which is where humans live in peace and harmony. And in this story we follow a young human girl who somehow ends up on the outside, and she strikes up a very unlikely friendship with a cursed monster who decides to protect her and to look after her, and we just follow the two of them and see their relationship, and it's so sweet and wholesome. I really love this story, and I'm very keen to carry on with this series. The only thing I will say is that I got the like cheap paperback version of this manga, and the quality of the images in here is really poor, and it's really hard to see a lot of the artwork because the images are very dark and it just hasn't printed well. So that really took away from my reading experience, because obviously when you read manga it's kind of 50-50. You appreciate the story, but you also have to appreciate the artwork. That's kind of why you read manga rather than just a novel. And so yeah, that was such a shame, because I've seen a more expensive deluxe edition of this manga and the images in it are gorgeous and I love the art style. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that, because if you're thinking of picking up this manga, I would highly recommend that you invest more and purchase the more expensive deluxe edition rather than going for the cheap paperback like I did. So yeah, that was disappointing, but I do think that I'm going to continue on with this series and probably invest a little bit more money next time. Okay, so next up we have Emily Wilde's Encyclopaedia of Faeries, written by Heather Fawcett. So this is a fairly new fantasy release. It's the first in a new series, and I ended up really enjoying this book. But I had a few issues with it in the beginning, which I'll get to in a minute. But what is this book about? So this is about Emily Wilde, who is a professor. She is a researcher who is very interested in finding out about fae folklore and fairy tales, and she's trying to write this encyclopedia of fairies. And so she is traveling around the world carrying out research, trying to gather as much information as she can about fairies and about fae folklore. And in this book we follow her as she travels up north to this Nordic town where she's trying to gather more information for her book. And the thing that's interesting about Emily Wilde is she's quite socially awkward, and she really struggles to interact with people, and that actually gets in the way of her research sometimes, because she really struggles to form positive relationships with the people who are around her and the people who she needs to interview and to get information from. And so she finds it quite difficult. She comes across as quite a frosty and awkward person. And then her academic rival, who is a man called Bumblebee, actually turns up in this Nordic town, and says that he's there to help her with her research. And at first she's really frustrated because she can't stand Bumblebee because he's the total opposite of her. He's incredibly full of himself, he's really charismatic and charming and really annoyingly handsome, and so she's kind of annoyed that he's there. But then she starts to realise that he's actually quite useful because he's really good at talking to people and getting more information out of the villages and things. So the two of them decide to work together to try and gather more information about the Fae and folklore of the area, and the story moves on from there. It turns into a more interesting fairy tale story because they uncover some darker secrets, I suppose, about the Fae. And yeah, but I don't want to say too much because I feel like it's fun to see the story unravel for yourself. But what I will say is that when I first started this book, I wasn't sure that I was going to get on with it because of the writing style, because it has a real academic writing style. So it's all told from Emily Wilde's perspective, and she is writing journal entries. So the book is written as if you are just following her journal entries and you're seeing her thoughts and feelings and her research. She's documenting her research and things like that, and she has that real academic tone. And she even includes things like footnotes. So there's like literally footnotes in this story that gives you more information about past research and about Fae folklore and things like that. So it reads a little bit dry in the beginning. But what I will say is that I'm glad that I continued on with this story because I absolutely fell in love with the characters by the end, and I just adored it when Bumblebee, her academic rival, showed up, because the two of them have this really fun energy together. Like, they butt heads and they really don't get on, and they bicker and they banter with each other, but it's just so funny. And by the end of the book I came to feel like really close to the main character of Emily Wilde. I found her to be quite endearing. I liked how dry she was, and I could also relate to quite a lot of her social awkwardness and how she would much prefer to just cuddle up with a book rather than to go and actually socialise with people. Like, I feel like that's quite relatable. And yeah, I just adored the characters in here by the end of the story, so I did end up really loving this one. So I would recommend this to you if you're looking for a really cosy fantasy story. What I will say though is that if you initially don't like the writing style, do try and carry on, because I feel like it definitely pays off by the end. And for me anyway, I did end up falling in love with the story and the characters. So yeah, I love this one. Okay, so next up we have Before They Are Hanged by Joe Abercrombie. So this is the second book in the first Law trilogy, and I read this one on audio with my fiance, and we actually started it a while ago and just happened to finish it in February because we listened to it on just 1x speed. I can't listen to audiobooks fast forwarded. Like, a lot of people listen to them like on 2x speed or something, and I just don't understand how. My brain just can't process auditory information that fast. So yeah, we've been listening to it very slowly, but we've both been really enjoying it. And this is a adult grimdark fantasy, and it's a series that I find really difficult to talk about because while there is a lot going on with the plot, like quite an interesting political and complex plot, it's also quite meandering, and we have several different threads of plotline going on throughout the story, so it's really difficult to explain it succinctly. So I think the best thing to do is to discuss the characters within these books, because it is incredibly character driven, this story, and they are 100% the star of the show. The characters are the reason why I keep coming back to this series and why I'm so excited to read them. And so yeah, it's multi-POV, and we have loads of really interesting, morally grey characters in these books. So we have a character called Glocta, who's probably my favourite character, and he is an ex-war hero turned torturer. And he is also an incredibly sarcastic and jaded character, and he actually is described as a cripple because he was captured by the enemy many years ago and was tortured himself, and that's left him incredibly scarred both mentally and physically, and he has to deal with chronic pain every day. He walks with a limp, and he's just a fascinating character to read from. We then have Logan Ninefingers, who is a northern barbarian fighter. He's incredibly like fierce, exactly what you would imagine from a barbarian, and he's become separated from his group. We then have Giselle, who is this pompous nobleman who looks down on the lower classes and is pretty full of himself and thinks he's really, you know, handsome. And he's also a really incredibly skilled swordsman. So in the first book we follow him while he's doing a fencing competition. And then we have Pharaoh, who is a ex-slave, and she is also an incredibly skilled fighter. We also have Biaz, who is a magi, so he is magical. He has magic powers and he's incredibly powerful. And yeah, I think that's most of the main characters really, and they're all so interesting. And what I will say is that I think the narrator for the audiobooks does such a good job at bringing these characters to life. He uses different accents for different characters, and he just really gives them life, and I really feel like I know the characters really well, and I just love hearing about them and seeing what they do and how they try to survive in this really bleak world, because it's a grim, dark setting, so it's a very sort of can feel a little bit depressing environment that they're in. But what I do also appreciate about this story is that the author, Joe Abercrombie, uses quite a lot of humour as well to lift the story, which I think is needed because it's such a stark, grim setting. So yeah, we do get quite a lot of humour, a lot of dark humour, and that comes in the form of hearing people's internal monologue. Like, it's quite funny, particularly with Glockter because he's so sarcastic. And we also get quite a lot of humour between characters, so they have quite a lot of banter between each other and they, you know, joke with each other, and it's quite funny as well. So yeah, I really enjoy this story, but it's probably not for you if you're a plot-driven reader, or if you like a hard magic system within your fantasy, because there isn't really much explanation around the magic, or at least there isn't yet. And I've read the first 2 books, so you just kind of have to go with the fact that, you know, the Magi has magic. So yeah, that's my thoughts really on that book. Okay, so next up we have Below by Laurel Hightower. So this is a horror novella, and it's a reimagining of the Mothman legend. So if you know that legend, then you might have a bit of an idea of what this story is about. But this is basically a monster horror, and I had so much fun reading this story. It's incredibly fast paced, it kept me on the edge of my seat, and it was so easy to just fly through. I had a great time. So in this story we follow our main character, who is a recently divorced woman, and she is travelling in her car during a snowstorm. She's driving across the mountains of West Virginia, I think, and she ends up meeting this truck driver when she stops off at a rest stop. And the truck driver can see that she's quite anxious and quite nervous about driving on the icy, snowy roads, so he decides to help her, and the two of them kind of form a convoy. So she follows behind the truck driver and he's helping her to negotiate these dangerous roads. But then things start to get a bit weird. So our main character starts to experience some electrical faults within her car, things start playing up, and then the truck driver sees something in the middle of the road and he swerves to avoid it and ends up crashing his truck. So he comes off the road, and they're actually driving over a bridge at the time, so he falls off the bridge and the truck ends up going down into this ravine. And our main character is understandably freaking out, and she can't call for help because there's no signal on her phone because there's all these weird electrical faults happening. And so she decides to get out of her car and to go down to try and like scramble down the ravine to see if the truck driver is still alive and to see if she can help him in any way. And then things start to get weird and scary, and that's all I'm gonna say. Although I will mention that as she goes down this ravine, at one point she does end up in like a cave. So it gave me kind of the Descent vibes. If you've seen that horror movie, it's very claustrophobic and spooky and creepy, and I just really had a fun time with this one. The only thing that I will say is that I didn't love the ending. I thought it was a little bit silly, and I also felt like there were some things that were included within this story that didn't really make sense. So it doesn't give you all of the answers, and I feel like some things were just included because they were spooky or because they were cool, when they didn't necessarily need to be there because it was just confusing and didn't make sense. So yeah, I did have a few issues with it. I definitely enjoyed the first half of the book a lot more than the second half, but all in all I had a really fun time reading this one and would recommend it if you're looking for a monster horror. Okay, so next up we have a couple of graphic novels. So we have Garlic and the Vampire and Garlic and the Witch. So these are really cute middle grade graphic novels, and I read both of them in one sitting because they're really quick and easy to get through. And I had such a fun time with this one. It was such a nice, refreshing, light read, and I just love the concept. I love the artwork in here. So these books follow our main character Garlic. So it's set in this town where there are all of these vegetable folk that were created by a witch because she needed some helping hands within her garden. So she made all of these sort of vegetable people so that they could help her in her garden. And in this first book, Garlic and the Vampire, the vegetable folk notice that someone has moved in to this creepy mansion next door, and they're really worried that it is a vampire. And so they kind of coerce our main character Garlic to go and confront this new neighbour because they know that vampires are afraid of Garlic, so they feel like she will be safe and she's the best person to go and confront him. And so we follow her as she goes on this adventure, and it's very much a story about our main character overcoming her anxieties because she's a very anxious person, and it's about her finding herself and believing in herself, and it's very sweet and wholesome. And then the second one, Garlic and the Witch, is about Garlic who goes on another adventure, and she travels to this magic market because she's trying to find a rare ingredient that the witch needs for one of her potions. And this second book is much more about Garlic having to accept changes in her life, and it talks quite a lot about how sometimes you can't be prepared for the big changes, and so that also had quite a nice little moral in it as well. So yeah, I had a really fun time with these ones. I do think I enjoyed the first one more than the second one, just because I feel like the novelty wore off a little bit in the second one. But yeah, if you're looking for something sweet, I would definitely recommend this one, or if you have a little one in your life, then I would recommend picking these ones up, because I do think that they are just adorable and the perfect little easy middle grade story. So yeah, I had a great time reading those. Okay, and finally the last book that I picked up in February was Crossroads by Laurel Hightower. So after reading below, I wanted to try more of this author's work, and I saw that Crossroads got a lot of positive reviews, so I thought that I would give it a go for myself on my Kindle, and I unfortunately didn't end up loving this one. It just wasn't my thing. So this is a story about a grieving mother who's tragically lost her son in a car accident, and we see at what lengths she will go to see her son again, essentially. And it's just a very sad story. It's pretty heavy to read. Definitely check out the trigger warnings, as with all of these books. But yeah, I just felt like deflated reading it, and I feel like it's quite obvious from the beginning of this book where the story is headed, and you're just forced to watch this character go down this path that you know isn't going to lead anywhere good. And I just felt it dragged a little bit because I was just waiting for the inevitable to happen. And so yeah, I just found it quite a sad story really, and I wasn't scared. I didn't find it entertaining. It does explore some really interesting themes, particularly around motherhood and about the sacrifices that you make as a mother, and about mental health and grief, obviously. So there were definitely a lot of interesting discussions, and I do think that it was done really well. It's just not something that I enjoyed reading, so I couldn't give it like a high rating because I didn't have fun when I was reading it. But that's not to say that it's not a really good book, and I do know that this story has really high ratings, so take what I say with a pinch of salt. If you like grief horror, then I do think this is probably quite a good one to try. So yeah, that was the last book that I read in February. So yeah, I'm really pleased with my reading month, and I had a nice variety of books that I read, and I'm feeling really motivated with my reading actually. I'm hoping that I can carry on reading loads of books each month. But yeah, I hope that you've enjoyed this video. Thank you so much if you're still here. Please don't forget to like this video if you liked it, because it really helps out my channel, and subscribe if you want to see more content from me. And yeah, I guess I'll see you next time with another video. Bye!